My name's Larry Turk. I have the pleasure of being the superintendent of Eleanor Roosevelt National Historic Site, the home of Franklin D. Roosevelt and Vanderbilt Mansion and Martin Van Buren National Historic Site. So I'm very blessed, and y'all are very blessed to be here today and to hear from Eleanor Roosevelt. It's a treat to have her here. So I'll turn the time over to Kathleen Durham.
Okay. That was short.
Yep. Somebody took my lemonade.
I took your lemonade.
It's too hot.
Hi. Can you hear me without the mic? Yeah. So let me just say, first, before Larry goes, I'm Kathleen Durham. I'm the director of the Eleanor Roosevelt Center, which is just down the road. But we are very blessed to have a relationship with Larry and the National Park Service. And Nina will tell you more about that later. But I'm especially happy that Larry is here as our superintendent. I mean, it's a big job, really. So thank you for coming to our first ever tea in the afternoon. Right? Yeah. You didn't know you'd be the first ever. And somebody said, I hope you keep doing this. Well, we'd have to ask Nina and Janet if they would continue to do it with us. So we're happy that you're here. I have some board members here. If you would just stand, just so we could say thank you for being here. Eleanor Roosevelt, you wanna? This is Curtis Roosevelt's This is Curtis Roosevelt's daughter. And Nina's Eleanor's great-granddaughter. And Nina's cousin. And she's on our board, and she came out from California for this event. Any other board members here? Me. And of course, Nina is on our board. I didn't get you. So Nina has been on our board for 2 years now, and you can imagine how delighted we are to have both of them on our board. Nina's going to tell you about the Eleanor Roosevelt Center, but just to emphasize what we do, we actually put Eleanor's leadership, social justice, and human rights leadership in action through girls, hopefully through young men next year, and college students and women, citizens all. So Nina will tell you more about that. Someone asked about the tea that you're drinking. It's actually something we sell called Tea with Eleanor. It's from Harney and Sons. Allegedly, it was her favorite tea, Irish breakfast, black tea. So enjoy. If you want to buy some, you know where to find me. right over there. This maquette, if you've been to Riverside Park has the big one of these, and this was done, commissioned by a group of people who were supporters, part of the board of the Eleanor Roosevelt Center. And we love this maquette. They had a picture of it right after the election, and I think there was a sign on it that was, yeah, right. So we have these too. If you're interested, just let me know.
I first want to give just thanks from the bottom of my soul, my heart.
Nina Roosevelt-Gibson. What a woman.
Heavens, the breeze is blowing. To the Park Service and to Superintendent Turk, because the Park Service people here, they have made this place the love that my grandmother exhibited when we all lived here and when she lived here. And this was her retreat, her place. This reflects her more than anything. And the Park Service, everybody that works here, and they work very, very hard. I can attest to that. Because we used to have to do a lot of the things that they're doing now when we were kids, and we would, oh no, we have to fix the road, we have to do this, we have to mow the lawns, we have to, anyway, and they have just done such a beautiful job, not just here, but all over our country, where they're protecting our history and who we are as a culture and a people. And so my deepest gratitude really goes to every person in the Park Service, and particularly those that are, part of the Roosevelt, Vanderbilt, and Van Buren now legacies. And I also want to thank the Eleanor Roosevelt Center at Val-kill for helping, to put this on, because we used to have tea every single afternoon with my grandmother here all summer long, and in the wintertime, whenever she was here, wherever she was, she always had stopped for tea. And as children, we had tea on the lawn here. We were usually not even dressed as well as we're dressed today. We were in our bathing suits or shorts or whatever, but we always had tea, and she read stories to us. She read, the Just So stories. She read all kinds of wonderful books to us, and it was really a time for the grandchildren. It was actually the only grandchildren that were there were my brother and my sisters and me, and then we had some second cousins. My grandmother's niece, Ellie Roosevelt, brought her 4 children here every summer, and the 8 of us became this little gang, and so we were the children, the gang of the children. Anyway, so I want to thank the center, and the center is legislated into existence. Literally, the Eleanor Roosevelt Val-kill Center is a legislative whatever you call them. What do you call them? A dictum or something? I don't know. But anyway, they were legislated. But of course, as our Congress often does, legislation with no money. So we have been over the years doing everything we can to promote my grandmother's legacy through human rights, through civil kinds of education, through all kinds of programs, and everybody that's connected with the center, we sometimes call it ERVK, or the Center at Val-kill. They are dedicated, wonderful, wonderful people, and every member of the board. And there's a couple of extra members that just came. If you want to stand up, Donna and Mark, back there, two of our, and Mark and Donna have been part of the board forever. So if any of you really want to know more about the center, please contact Kathleen. We realize that very few people really know that much about how we're working hard to promote the legacy. And this tea is part of that legacy, because my grandmother's legacy really includes how did Val-kill run when she was alive. There were heads of state, kings, queens, and then people with no means whatsoever. There were juvenile delinquents for picnics, literally from the Wiltwick School. So we had the gamut of everybody coming here, and every single person was treated exactly the same. If you were the Queen of England or the Queen Mother came and was in our stone cottage, she was treated the same way as the juvenile delinquents that had been sent up from New York City and sent to reform school, which was Wiltwick School. So that was part of her legacy. And in that, how did all this run? How was she able to do what she did? And that's why, as extended family members, we have the daughters of Marge and Les Entrup, who came here and made the last 6-8 years of my grandmother's life peaceful, loving. They ran this place, with precision. And some of it's very funny. How did they do it? Some of it is just lovely. And we really wanted to share that with everybody so that, in a sense, you understand who Eleanor Roosevelt really was inside. Not just what she signed or what speech she gave, but who she was every day living, for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and how the beds were changed, how the flowers were put out, all that kind of thing. So, do you want to start, Barbara? This is Barbara Entrup, and this is Janet, and they're sisters. You might not know it, but they are. So, and the other thing is we're going to sort of tell some stories, and then we hope that maybe you'll ask questions or share your own stories, because many of you may have some wonderful stories, and I've learned so much from hearing stories about my grandmother. So, Barbara.
Well, hi everybody, and oh boy, I'm not good at this, so you'll have to bear with me. And Nina has asked me to say a little bit about how my parents, in the very beginning, wound up here. And there was a family that worked for the Roosevelt family, even for the president, for many, many years, and many of you may know them, and I haven't been around, and many of you may even be part of that family, but it was the Kernan family from Hyde Park. And when I was a young girl, too young, I married a Kernan, and he was the younger brother. And my parents were looking for some kind of work, and Charlie Kernan, who really was the head honcho around here, for lack of a better word, that's what he was. And they needed help on Memorial Day, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And someone had left, and they were left in the lurch. So Charlie came over and asked my parents, Marge and Les, my mother in particular, if she could come over and help, cook and get things back in line for Memorial Day. Well, my mom was like, oh my God, I can't do that. I didn't tell you this either, but one of the things my mother said is, she won't want me to work for her because we're Republican. I forgot to tell you, she did say that. So Charlie said, no, really, you have to meet her. Well, my mother still wouldn't go, but my dad went. And he came back and he said, we have to at least help them out of this. Well, they hadn't mentioned anything further at that time. But after that weekend, and one of the things that happened was, Mom didn't find out till after, because I don't know how many people were there, many.
Yeah.
It wound up that in prior years, they had it catered. Charlie didn't tell them that. So they had to do all this work, and there were only a couple other people helping. Anyway, my dad went back home, and he told Mom, you have to talk to her, because Mrs. R came up to him and asked him if they would come on and work. And first Mom said no, and then he kind of talked to her, and they decided to try it. So they wound up living here. My sister Janet lived in what we always called the cross room upstairs originally, and then they went down to where the the guest center is, where the gift shop is now. That was their apartment. But
We were having trouble hearing you.
oh, okay.
Just raised it up a little, so.
Okay. So that they lived there, and that's how this family got involved. And as Nina said, this was a family affair. It would be nothing for, well, my sister and myself, and actually I should just go quick over that part. As you come in the lane, there's a very large stand of arborvitae trees halfway in. There used to be a house behind those trees. And that's where my husband, who took care of the sheep, lived. We lived. And so we were always here too. And no matter if Mom had 20 people for breakfast, so many for dinner and all, everybody here, including Nina and her family, helped. So that's how we got here. And now we want to...
Yeah.
Well, Barb's told you how Mom and Dad came to be here. The main thing I want to do, I lived right here in the house and saw a lot. And I have some absolutely wonderful memories of things that went on here. So we're going to try to bounce back and forth a little bit, but I want to tell you about a couple of my memories. Well, a few of my memories. Mom and Dad started in the spring of 1957. So I think I was in junior high, and Nina was too, but we were on split sessions, so we didn't really see much of each other. But I just want to share some really fun memories that I have. Mrs. R had the most wonderful secretary in the world. Her name was Maureen Corr. She was a sweet Irish woman and a devout Catholic. I'm Catholic, not as devout as she was, but I'm Catholic. And Mrs. Roosevelt always wanted to make sure that we got to Mass on Sunday morning, and she would go up to St. James, so she would drop us off in front of Regina Caeli, and then she would drive up to St. James, and then I don't know whether Reverend Kidd was a long talker or if Mrs. Roosevelt spent so much time after the service talking that Maureen and I waited quite a while for her to come back. So I just became really close with Maureen. She was almost like my other advisor when I didn't feel I could talk to my parents. So Mrs. R would pick us up, and then we would go to the farm stands. She loved to go buy food at the farm stands. She would come back with all kinds of, blueberries, strawberries, vegetables, and we'd get back. She drove an old station wagon. We'd get back and unload the back, and she'd bring it in, and she'd say, "Oh, Marge, I bought this, 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 and this," and Mom dreaded it because she knew how much, there was fruit to make jams and all kinds of things going on. So it was a lot of fun, and I just wanted to mention that Maureen at the knit-in that Patsy Costello organized told the story of the cherries. My mother was very outspoken. She didn't mince words. So Mrs. R came in with this big box of cherries, and I think there were probably it was a Sunday, so there were probably 14, 16 people for lunch, maybe 10 or 12 for dinner. And Mrs. R comes up with the cherries, and she says, "Marge, I think it would be lovely if we could have cherry pie for dessert tonight." And Mom puts her hands on her hips, and she says, "And just who do you think is going to pick the cherries? I've got lunch, dinner." So Maureen went up to her bedroom to change and came down to the kitchen for a cup of tea. And there in the summer kitchen around the table was Mrs. Roosevelt and a few other of the guests pitting cherries. Barbara, too, I guess, was there. So that's one of my Maureen stories. And I don't know, do you want to go back, or do you want me to tell some more of mine?
Tell some more. You've got great stories.
Okay, I'll give you some more memories. I told you the cherry story, so...
Tell the hospital story.
Oh, I'll tell you the hospital story. After I graduated from high school, I went to nursing school in Burlington, Vermont, and I was up there for a couple of years. I got pneumonia, and they didn't want to send me back here because it was such a long trip, and they didn't want to leave me alone in the dorm, so they hospitalized me. And Mom was very, very upset about it. Now, when I came down with the pneumonia, I was rotating through a medical surgical floor, and the head nurse on that floor loved to kid around with the student nurses and give us a hard time and tease us and everything. So I was in there a couple of days, and she came down to my room, and she said, "Well, your friends are getting even with me because one of them just called and wanted to know how you were doing and told me she was Eleanor Roosevelt." And so I said, "Well, what did you say to her?" And she said, "Well, if you're Eleanor Roosevelt, I'm Harry S. Truman," and I hung up. So, needless to say, when she found out it really was Eleanor Roosevelt she hung up on, she was really embarrassed. But I have a little note somewhere where I know Mrs. Roosevelt called back and reassured her that I was doing fine. So that's one story. Another one, this one is close to my heart because it shows her generosity. When I was a senior in high school, I had been accepted to a couple of colleges and a couple of nursing schools because that's what I wanted to do. And Miss Wood, my friends who are here will remember Miss Wood, the guidance counselor, called me into the office and asked me what I was doing after I graduated. Well, my parents had had some illnesses by then, and I knew that money was an issue. So I just told Miss Wood, I said, "Well, I'm not sure, I want to go to nursing school or one of the colleges, but, finances are not good right now, and I'm just not sure yet. I can't make a decision yet." So I didn't think anything about it, and about 3 days later, Maureen came into the kitchen, and she said, "Marge and Les and Janet, Mrs. Roosevelt would like to talk to you." And I'm thinking, oh my God, did I do something wrong? Am I in trouble? So we went in, and she said, Miss Wood called me and told me that Janet isn't sure what she's doing because of finances. And Dad was like so embarrassed. And she said, I've taken care of it. I will be paying the tuition. And Dad was like, no, you can't do that. And this is where the generosity, she said, don't be ridiculous. She said, I do this for people I don't even know. So of course I'll do it for you. And she did. She gave so much of her money away. So that one's just very close to my heart. I wanted everybody to know that. Do you want to?
Before I hand it to Barbara, I'm going to pick up on the driving to the farmer's market. My sister and I had a younger sister. She was 4 years younger than I was, and we used to go to the farmer's market with grandmother. Not so much every Sunday, but sometime on Saturdays or whatever. And one time we went. My grandmother was a wonderful woman. She was a terrible driver. So we get in the car, we go off, and it was across the river. We go across the river, everything's fine. We come to a stop sign. She stops like you're supposed to, and she looks both ways, and then she starts to go again because nobody was coming. Well, the car had stalled, and it was, at that time, my Uncle Franklin was in the Fiat business, so he was giving her Fiats, which were manual transmission. So the car had stalled. Well, her hearing was pretty bad, too, and I guess she didn't have her hearing aid up. So she realized it wasn't going anywhere, so we have to, go through all the motions of turning everything off and then starting the car again. So then she starts the car again, but she'd already looked 10 minutes ago, so she didn't need to look again. So off we go. Then there's a screeching of a pickup truck. It was a red pickup truck going north and south as we're going east-west. And this poor person sort of veered off the road, didn't flip, fortunately, and really no damage was done. But the guy was a little upset that this car was just coming, so he gets out of the car and he was ready for battle, and he realized who it was. Oh, Mrs. Roosevelt, I'm so sorry, I was in your way. And then the other story, I want to tell you how my grandmother hired people. There was one time, and this is just before the Entrups came. It was a Friday afternoon. On Thursday evening, I think, she had a house full of people coming from New York to stay at Val-kill. The house was going to be full of people, and her cook quit. Well, she had called my parents, one of the Kernans, Charlie Kernan's wife used to cook for my parents. So she had called my parents, and they had said, oh yeah, Millie can, step over and help out. But my grandmother's coming down the steps of the UN, and this little tiny woman, skinny, in broken English, says, Mrs. Roosevelt, I need a job. Where can I find a job? And my grandmother looked at her and looked at her watch, and she said, where do you live? And the woman gave her the address. And my grandmother had noticed, because there wasn't much my grandmother didn't notice, she noticed a tattoo on her arm. And she was limping. A tattoo, for those that didn't hear. And so she said, oh, I know where that is. Can you be ready in half an hour, and I will pick you up, and I need a cook. And Irene is her name. Oh, yeah. Well, Irene couldn't cook. There's no way Irene. And in fact, we as children, sometimes we were not very nice. And if Irene made a pound cake, we'd say, don't drop a piece on your foot will break. But Irene, we loved Irene. Irene stayed with us. Even after my grandmother died, she then lived with the Goreviches. And they took care of her until Irene finally died. But she had literally come practically from the concentration camp to my grandmother's, and this whole family we loved, and that the Entrups helped when Irene was trying to help, and sometimes she couldn't do what she wanted to do. The Entrups and their family would pitch in for her so that she always held her dignity and she was always taken care of, and that's the legacy of my grandmother. Now, Bart's another story. And then we want your stories, please.
One of my favorite stories is that I was only like 20 or 19 when I became very ill while I was pregnant for my first daughter. I was 19, I think, and wound up in North and Dutchess Hospital, which at that time was just like a giant house. It is nothing like it is today. And I was laying there with the nurses and talking, and the next thing I know, there's all this hustle bustle, and the nurses are all running in and out, and I'm like, what's the matter? And they said, you won't believe this, Mrs. Roosevelt's coming down the hallway. And here she was. She came down, and she had goodies for me and a doctor from the city. And I don't think that was David. That was somebody she brought from the city. But she said, you know, we're going to get you better. And it's just part of how she was. Most people don't realize that she treated all of us, you know, we never felt like the help. We always felt like we could talk to her. And, well, she was much younger than me, what?
Yeah, much younger.
Yes, you were. But we just always felt close to her, and my parents grew to adore her. Well, they didn't grow. That really happened immediately, wouldn't you say? And then my mom, the same. Mom became ill with numerous things over the time she worked here, and she wound up in the hospital. And the same thing happened to Vassar Hospital. They were always on their toes because they never knew when she was coming. And it was a picture because I think you have a couple stories about Grandmere and my brother-in-law, Tubby.
Oh,
But
yes,
even
you have
in
to
the
tell about
hospital, Mom used to say how hysterical it was because Tubby was about 6'4" or 5" and 370 pounds, and Mrs. R was about 6 foot.
Yeah, well, she was shrinking later in life, but she was tall and
And plus she was Mrs. Roosevelt. So you see these two walking down the hall. It was kind of quite a picture. Intimidating. And she was just, and now I look back at it, when you live like that, when you're, I have a friend who grew up with Leonard Bernstein, and her mother was his gal Friday, and they traveled everywhere. But she never even thought anything of it until she was an adult, because it's your life and it isn't anything special or different. We did have many times when we knew, oh, JFK is here and Khrushchev is coming and whatever. It was always somebody here. But we all have talked about this, Nina too, even though she's a Roosevelt, we didn't appreciate it like we do now. That we should have kept more things, but you didn't have phones and just click pictures back then either. And I have to also add that we have had such a wonderful reunion. It was just like yesterday. It's just been fabulous. So.
yes, we have to tell the Tubby story. Oh, and tell her driving.
Okay,
Because
I
that
have
goes with my day.
a couple of car-related stories. The Tubby, well, the summer kitchen looked out on sort of the front of where, I don't know if all the tours came in that way, but the front entrance to the house. And there was a big tree there with a small stone wall around it. So whenever Mrs. R, we kind of intimated she was not the best driver in the world, she'd go out and get in the car, and we'd all go to the window and say, wait for it. And she would back up and boom, right into the thing. And the other related story is, they already said Tubby was like 375 pounds. Mrs. Roosevelt was this tall, dignified woman. She would get in the passenger side of the Fiat. Tubby would get her in, close the door, and then Tubby would go around the other side and get in the Fiat, and the Fiat would go So we used to enjoy that. And one other driving thing that has nothing to do with that, we didn't have a car while we were here because we always used the station wagon. And I got my driver's permit. And Dad was frequently busy, so I didn't get much practice. But one of my friends one day said, well, I've got my license. If you want to go practice, we'll go practice. So we were practice driving and going down Route 9 in Hyde Park, going right past the Roosevelt estate there. And I'm like, you know, just not experienced, driving very slowly, very cautiously down the road. And don't I get pulled over by the state trooper? And he says, well, you look very suspicious. You're driving so slowly. So I tried to explain to him that, you know, I just got my driver's permit, and my friend was riding with me and everything. He says, let me see the car registration. So I give him Eleanor Roosevelt's car registration. And he was fine. He said, okay. You know, he laughed, I think. I came home and made the mistake of telling my father what had happened. That was it. He said, you're never driving a car again. So I never got my license because I had no experience. He wouldn't let me drive a car. So, you want to switch, or you want me to keep going with something else? Okay, I'll keep going for one more.
Actually, you're doing great for somebody who was a nervous.
I'm not a public speaker, but you know what? The reason I can do this today is because Mrs. Roosevelt's looking down on me, and I hope she's enjoying this tea as much as we are. There's my one other story. I had slept overnight at a friend's house who lived right down on Creek Road. We're not very far from here at all. And Mom called me the next morning, and she said, if you two can get dressed over and get over here within the next half hour, 45 minutes, you can go with Mrs. Roosevelt and Harry Belafonte over to the Wiltwick School, because he's going to perform. Well, you never saw two teenage girls get ready so fast in your life. I mean, we practically ran up the whole road, I think. So we got here, and we got to ride in the limousine. Mr. Belafonte and his wife and Mrs. Roosevelt sat in the back, and we had those little, like, jump seats, and we sat there and just stared at them for the whole trip. It was like the highlight of my life up to then, I think. And we went over there to the Wiltwick School. He sang Day-O and Scarlet Ribbons, and I think I probably cried. And then the Wiltwick band had a wonderful steel band, the Wiltwick School. The boys were taught they made their own steel drums, and they had this wonderful steel band. So, I mean, I still remember it was a wonderful memory. So.
I'm going to follow up on Harry Belafonte. When Harry Belafonte came here, he was newly married, and we couldn't remember her name, and she was absolutely gorgeous, just gorgeous woman. Anyway, they were coming here and I don't think they hadn't been married more than a couple of weeks. And so one of my cousins, actually she was a second cousin, Barbara Morgan, and I, because they were newlyweds, we thought, oh goody, let's short sheet their bed. So we clued Gromere in, because Gromere she had a wonderful sense of humor, which a lot of people don't really realize. And so we went to her just to tell her that this was our plan, and she said, well, Nina and Barbara, I really would rather we do something else, because my old sheets, I don't think they'll take his feet pushing down. They might rip. And so she said, why don't you put cornflakes in their bed? So we did. But we were too scared to put too many, because we knew Marge they would probably sweep them out onto the floor, and then Marge would have to have somebody go up and clean them. And I can remember Marge saying, you children, get out of the kitchen! Get out of my way! So we were terrified of Marge, but we didn't want to cross Marge too often. So we just put a few cornflakes, and then we waited the next morning at breakfast, and there wasn't a sign of anything. So I don't know what happened, but anyway.
Let me think. Well, this is really probably not part of the program, but I just want to say there are some other Entrups here today, and that would be my brother's children and his widow, and they are all here today, and I'm just so excited to see you guys. And they have memories of their own too. And again, it was like the family thing. We're a pretty big family, and I think they will attest too that they felt like part of the family, although they were young. They were little. Like my girls, well, lots of story I could tell. My oldest daughters were only like 3 and 4, but the 4-year-old still remembers when Mrs. R on Christmas Eve would have all of her grandchildren and other family children in the, what would we call that room? The living room? The living room. And she would read to them the night before Christmas and other Christmas stories. She always, when they were little, because have my kids too, and I think some of the Kernan kids even. And she just wanted, that was her family. And it was just, now thinking about it, it's more special now to me than it was then.
Maybe, you want to?
Just a couple of other things. I think the kids back there also remember the swimming pool. Yeah, you remember the swimming pool, yeah. I just wanted to mention, to go along with Christmas, Christmas gifts.
Oh, yes, in the
Mrs. Roosevelt, and I'm letting Nina talk about that, gave out a lot of Christmas gifts, and I was fortunate enough I like to wrap gifts, and every day when I would come home from school around Christmas time, Mom would say, go on up to the cross room, there's more gifts up there, and she would, like, purses for everybody, all the women, all the men got ties, and there were like, I'd go up and wrap like 30 purses and 25 boxes of ties and everything. She was just so generous, and she really did love Christmas. It was,
She had a special closet,
yeah,
that was
and
Christmas
the
closet.
Christmas closet upstairs.
She went like to Israel or places with you guys.
She-
Went, oh, so-and-so would love this.
Yeah.
The Christmas card.
So we got to, just have a wonderful time at Christmas. And, I mean, Mom and Dad were busy in the kitchen, and we helped out, too. I did a lot of the baking, and, we helped out with the dishes, because there was no washing machine. All the dishes got washed in the sink. But it was just such a wonderful time, and while they were in the kitchen, we could go in and listen to the stories being read and everything. So it really was special.
Speaking of the kitchen, I don't know if any of you have all been on the tour. It was not much of a kitchen. It was horrible, actually. And the things and the amount of meals, as Jan said before, it'd be nothing to have 15 or 20 for breakfast and that many or more for lunch, and then have a big dinner party or a picnic later in the day. And it was just him and her. And once in a while they had help come up from New York, Maria or Irene, and sometimes Bea, who was Joni's nurse, would pitch in and help all of us too. But the kitchen was really lacking. One refrigerator, although they had an old fridge down in the cellar. But it was quite a challenge to pull off what they pulled off.
Yeah, I used to ask Marge, because we lived in the stone cottage, and I spent more time sleeping over in my grandmother's house sometimes than I did in my own house. I'd go back and forth, and I'd figure out who was having the best meal, and then that's where I'd go. And so I'd ask Marge, how many people are coming for dinner tonight? And if she said 10, I said, oh, nobody's coming for dinner. I mean, that was a low number. So we often had, 20, 25, 30 people for meals, and how they ever did it, I don't know. And one Prince. No, go ahead.
I'll lose the thought if I don't tell you.
Okay, we're all at that age. When Princess Beatrix came, and she became Queen of the Netherlands, but she was still the princess at the time, and she came with her entourage. She was closer in age to my brother and to me, and my brother's roommate from college was here. And so my grandmother put all of us, Princess Beatrix, my brother, me, David, and probably there was one other, I can't remember if Grania Gravich was here or not, but she put us all at the children's table because she was convinced that the princess would much rather talk to us than to her. And that's how she treated everybody. I mean, it was just amazing. So,
I was just going to say, and it wasn't just when there were guests or weekends or when Mrs. R was here. All year long, whether it was the holidays or during the summer, Mrs. Roosevelt had guests here, or Uncle David was here forever. And
Elliot.
yeah, the Elliots and Charles Purcell and other people that would just come here and stay for several reasons, and some for very extended times. She had students that were working, doing research on the Roosevelts over at the library, and they would be put up here in the summertime, and Janet and I unearthed some really nice correspondence from someone named Nikolai and another one, I can't remember, but Mom and Dad had all of that. There was never a day off. And there was always somebody here, and Janet and I just can't get over the amount of letters and people that Mom and Dad literally took care of here, that they've appreciated my mother and father and kept. You know what I forgot to tell you about too, is my father, which is really made a wonderful friendship with Walter Reuther. And there are several letters from him. I didn't bring those with me. I should have. You have to. And things like that. You know, my father and mother were a jack of all trades, so to speak, but they were very loving and very
Outgoing.
yeah, very outgoing, and you felt attached right away. And they made friendships with a lot of the guests here that were long-lasting, one of them being Maureen Corr. My parents and Maureen had a lifelong, and then my sister kept that up until Maureen died also. So they had quite a life here, but it wasn't just being the cook and the whatever.
on that note, I just have to tell you that when my grandmother's final days, and she was quite sick actually through the summer before she died, and it was Marge and Les who made her life peaceful and helped her continue her dignity, because she was really quite sick before she died. And she was here, and I remember I was going off to the University of Michigan, and I went upstairs to say goodbye, and it was the hardest day of my life because I knew I would never see her again. And my grandmother to me was my grandmother. I adored her. And I was pretty old before I figured out that my grandparents were even famous, or that anybody. I thought everybody's name was Roosevelt. I mean, it was sort of like Smith or Gibson or whatever. But anyway, we would love to have you ask us questions. And please feel free to ask anything that you want. This is supposed to be really casual and really just, one-on-one. If we're all, just sitting around, which we are. And so please, what?
Just one sec. We're practically sisters. I could interrupt her. My daughter Cindy just reminded me of something that Janet and I both forgot. That when Mom first came here, Mrs. R had a day book. And she would write, Cindy remembered, we forgot. Mrs. Roosevelt would write every day, like 10 for breakfast, so many for lunch, but she would also write pancakes, home fries, everything. That was her breakfast, and then whatever, she would write the whole menu. Well, after about the third day, Mom's like, Mrs. R, some of your guests are not that happy, and I'm very unhappy. She said, you can't serve someone 3 and 4 starches for a meal. And so she said, well, what would you like? And so Mom gave her some ideas and everything. But Jana has the day book, and for the first, was it about a week?
No, more than that.
But there's days when Mrs. R has this all written down, and then very shortly after, there's nothing written down, and it's like just the amount of people. And Marge, do your thing.
She used to come into the kitchen and say, Marge, what's for dinner? So it started, I guess, she used to come in every night after meals and say, what a wonderful dinner you'd put out. So, one night it was like, the meal was atrocious. It was mashed potatoes, mac and cheese, and that pancake dessert, which was layered pancakes with brown sugar and maple syrup. And they said, all the women were on diets, and they didn't eat it. So that's when she sort of...
Mom said, no more.
So after that, she would just come in and say, okay, Marge, what's for dinner?
So, okay, you guys get to ask questions or tell your stories too, because that's how we even learn more. Who's going to be brave? Come on, somebody. Oh, good, a hand.
We took a tour.
Stand up.
We took a tour, and the guide mentioned, on rare occasions when Marge and Les were not available, Mrs. R used to cook.
Oh, she was a terrible cook. She didn't know how to cook. I promise you. No, that's true. I mean, she really didn't know how to cook. She got so excited about learning how to make a dessert one time. This was towards the end of her life, and it was ice cream right out of the freezer, and then strawberries, and I can't remember if they had to put whipped cream in it or not. And then she'd sit at the table, and there's a Roosevelt habit, a lot of the Roosevelts had, thank God I didn't get that one, where they chew their tongue when they're thinking, so it's... Anyway, I exaggerate. But, so my grandmother would sit at the table and she'd be stirring this thing that wasn't stirring, and the strawberries were getting mushed, but the ice cream was still hard, and everybody's waiting for the dessert, and she's stirring and stirring and stirring. And she got so excited about that, because to her she was preparing something. But she did try to cook, but and as children, we thought that every taste bud in her mouth probably had died long ago. Because she really didn't care. She was so much more interested in the people and in talking to them and listening to things at the table and the arguments that would go on. Because many of you may know, I had quite a Republican father. He was a Rockefeller Republican, and the conversations between my father and my grandmother was never disrespectful, but it was always interesting, and the Roosevelts tend to have very booming voices, so it got, sometimes pretty interesting, but yeah, no, I don't think she was much of a cook. Anybody else? Yes.
In 1934, my mother was polio scarred from the 17 epidemic, and she got into pharmacy school, which was unusual for a woman, let alone a handicapped woman. She couldn't go because there was no elevator. So my mother wrote a letter to your grandfather. It didn't get to him, but somehow or another it got to your grandmother. And she called the dean of Brooklyn College of Pharmacy. And it was an elevator in a year later. And my mother was the first PhD in pharmacy.
Thank you. Some others? You must have secret questions you would love. Yes, okay, yes.
My grandmother was Marge Entrup.
Right.
And I was about, my best memories were like 4 and 5 years old. And my Aunt Janet just mentioned the pool. The pool was at John's house.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, my father.
Yeah. So anyway, my father used to take me to swim, and he was a cheese, and he would, let go of me and stuff like that. And I just, I wouldn't trust anybody probably because he teased me so much. I thought I was going to drown. And one day she was in the pool at the same time as me, and she said, "I will teach you to swim." And
I just believed her. I knew that she wouldn't let me drown. She taught me to swim. And it was really only like 10 minutes. And it was just because of the trust and the love and everything that oh, I did become a lifeguard. But it was because of her and her person. Otherwise, I don't know how I would have learned.
That's great. Patsy? Oh, wait a minute, Patsy was gonna, and then we'll get back to you. Patsy's up here, but you,
Patsy Newman Costello from Hyde Park. I'm a Hyde Park native. Lived in the same house since 1940. And my father first worked for Vanderbilt's, and then he ended up working for Roosevelt's in the greenhouses in the gardens. And when Mrs. Roosevelt would bring visitors to the home or the library, she always parked her car at the greenhouse and let my father know that she was there, and he would make up some arrangements for her to bring back to Val-kill. So I was about probably in the 7th or 8th grade in school, and it was around St. Patty's Day, and I had made some green carnations out of tissue paper, which my father took in and wired them to the real carnation stems in the greenhouse. Well, she happened to come in that day, and she said to my father, "I didn't realize that these grew green." So he picked one off and he gave it to her. He says, "Only some of them do." So, and then as a teenager, I worked with Barbara and a few other girls in town at the local drugstore. And Mrs. Roosevelt used to come in on Sundays for her papers, and you know, we just treated her like any other neighbor. It was nothing special. So my mother was the president of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Home Club, which started in 1929 when he was governor of New York. He wanted the Hyde Park people to know what was going on in the state, in the country, and in the world. And every time he'd come back to Hyde Park, they'd meet at Springwood, and he'd tell them what was going on. But Mrs. Roosevelt used to invite us to tea here. After Memorial Day services, my mother, being the president of the home club at the time, would introduce the speakers like Adlai Stevenson, President or Johnson, Truman, all of them that she would introduce. I still have those programs in my house, and I have invitations that they were sent just to me. Miss Patsy Newman, Hyde Park, New York. Mrs. Roosevelt would stand at the end of the dining room table, serve, you know, you go around the table and helping yourself, and then she would have the homemade ice cream, chocolate or vanilla. Now, if you told her you wanted vanilla ice cream, she'd ask you if you wanted fresh strawberries on it. But if you told her chocolate, she never asked. So after I went there a few times, I realized if I wanted the strawberries, I had to tell her vanilla ice cream.
it wouldn't have occurred to her that the strawberries went with chocolate.
Right. Okay, here you go.
Oh, I love it. It's great. Now, you had a question or a comment?
A memory that I had.
Oh, good. Well, come on. Yeah.
It's Lori.
Oh, yes.
Granddaughter.
Well, another Marge.
But I have a memory of Christmas because she always had so many times we would go there for Christmas, and I remember the table being really big and really lavishly decorated. And I remember at the table, she always had a little cornucopia for all of us, and they were filled with goodies, you know, candies and stuff like that. And I was just a little girl. I didn't realize at the time that this was an added, touch from Mrs. Roosevelt. And she also sent me home with a present, and it was really special to me. It was a little, it was like a hand warmer, but it was fur, and it had a little doll head on it, and I remember it. And I also remember coming here as a little girl with my father and going into the pond with a boat and taking us fishing there, and it felt like home here. It was a very homey atmosphere. But another thing about Mrs. Roosevelt is this woman, Patsy, is that?
Patsy Costello, right.
She loved flowers, Mrs. Roosevelt. She was something with her flowers, and I remember being here on more than one occasion, and her on our way home looking in the back seat, and she would just leave flowers for us. And sometimes she'd leave a little note saying, "So nice to see you," or and I remember thinking, wow, that was really special, you know, but flowers mean a lot to me. I don't know if that has anything to do with her, but
Oh,
I
no,
love flowers.
it does. She made sure any guests that came to Hyde Park, and I don't care who they were, they always had fresh flowers in their room, which she cut from the flower garden. She put in the little vases, and then she and the rest of us, whoever was around, if there were a lot of them, we carried them up to the bedrooms. And that was it. There wasn't a guest who ever came here who didn't have fresh flowers in their room. So flowers were really important to her. And it's interesting because when she died, all she wanted was a pine bough on her very simple coffin. So anybody else? Oh, yes.
I want to know if you remember when Roosevelt narrated Peter.
Oh, yes, I have it actually.
Actually, I brought you a present. I have it also.
Oh,
I
wow.
have some pictures of the orchestra.
Oh,
Mrs. Roosevelt standing there with Ola Wittgenstein, the conductor.
yes,
remember?
yes.
And I was 11, so I don't, you know, I was there. So you were also there?
No, I wasn't there. No, I wasn't there, but I know she gave me, a copy of it. And every time I hear anything from Peter and the Wolf, that's all I can think of. And isn't that?
It's yours.
Oh, thank you. Wow. Oh, what a treat. Thank you. Right, yes. Wow. That is very special. Anybody else, any questions that you want to know about life, how the house ran or anything like that? Yes.
Did you ever see your grandmother rest?
Yeah, I'll tell you when she rested. I traveled with her a lot. Not a lot, well, quite a bit. And we went on one trip which was about almost 2 months long. And we went to the Middle East, we went to Israel, we went all over the place. Anyway, my grandmother would get on an airplane or on a train, car, wherever. She'd sit down, buckle her seatbelt on the airplane, put her head down, she was out. She would sleep. She could sleep sitting anywhere. And one time, we were in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre it was in Jerusalem, and it was Easter Sunday, and we went to the church services, and they were rotating at that time, and so we ended up in a Greek Orthodox service. Now, the church is tiny, it's low, it's dark, there's no electricity, and many of you have probably visited there. So you're given a candle, and you go in with the candle, and then you sit down. Well, Greek Orthodox services, you sit, you stand, you sit, you stand, you're up and down, and you have this candle, and that's the only light in there. My grandmother would sit down, start to fall asleep, the candle was going like this. I was terrified she was going to burn herself or burn the church down or whatever. So I was constantly kind of nudging her and then helping her hold the candle, because the minute she sat down, she could just fall sound asleep. And that's, and people always say, well, it seems like she never slept. Well, she knew when to sleep. And it's quite a gift to be able to do that. Anybody else? Yes. Oh, good.
Hi, Nina. I was wondering, did she ever talk about her childhood?
Not really. My grandmother was, I hate to tell you how old I was before I really even knew anything about FDR. Because our family really, most of us, now there are some exceptions, but most of us, it really was about today and tomorrow and going forward. It wasn't about the past. And my parents were really strong about we were not special. Our grandparents were special. We were not, unless we did something ourselves. And that, I believe, is one of the best lessons anybody can ever have. And my grandmother was kind of like that too. The past was the past, and she was worried about tomorrow. And how were people going to get fed? How, or were we going to be able to come together and respect one another regardless of all the differences and that kind of thing. So she really didn't. Occasionally you'd hear say, something particularly, well, with me, because I was very shy, very quiet, and she knew I hated, social kinds of things, and my mother was quite the opposite, and wanted me to be social and, do all this thing. And so I'd run to my grandmother, get me out of this, and she'd say, no, Nina, you have to learn how to handle it. So, but,
She was very shy.
right, and then she'd say, she said, I had to overcome it, you have to overcome it. So,
Can I just mention something?
yes, oh yes.
I just want to mention one quick thing. She said that with Mrs. Roosevelt, tomorrow is now. And I just led a book discussion with my book club based on her book, Tomorrow is Now. It's very short, it's very brief, but it's really good. I would highly recommend it if you want to read a book by Mrs. Roosevelt. It's very contemporary. You'd think she wrote it last year. It's really good.
I have something to add if it's okay.
Yeah, of course.
I just want to say something again about, I just came into my head about how wonderful she was with her family, and we were extended family. So much so that when Mrs. Roosevelt died, she made sure that we were all part of everything. And my father, my husband at the time, who was Pat Kernan, and Charlie Kernan, and I can't remember the others, but they were all, at her request, pallbearers when she passed. And my sister and my parents and my brother and I were in the car behind the family. I mean, it was her way that we were just family, and we never forgot that. We just, it was amazing.
Yeah, yes.
When she died, I was in school up in Vermont, and I got called into the director's office, and I knew Mrs. Roosevelt was very ill, but she called me in and she said, Mrs. Roosevelt has passed away. We're putting you on a bus. You are going home immediately to attend that funeral, because apparently they felt it was important enough to have us all together.
Well, and she would have wanted, because we were extended family. I mean, these are my sisters. So, it's true. Anybody else want to add? Right, newly minted. We're elderly. Oh, yes, okay, yes, please. Oh, good.
Just for you. Do you remember supporting the Hyde Park Playhouse?
Oh, yes, I worked there.
I was the one that worked with you as a
Oh,
apprentice.
oh, really? Wow. And I was
Remember
underage.
the day we had to get the horse and buggy to go through Hyde Park?
Yes.
Advertise and all
Right. Oh, yes. Yeah, well, that was and Charles Purcell was the one that got me to go over there with, and Gore Vidal was running the Hyde Park Playhouse at the time. And actually, this is really bizarre, because I'm the farthest thing from any kind of, sex image, but they had this little tiny part in The Matchmaker where this prostitute says something about, you're in the men's room, honey, or something like that, and they made me play the part. And he said, Gore Vidal said to me, can't you find a sexy dress or something? No. So, but, no, I wasn't. Right, but yeah, 'cause my father kept trying to sabotage my working over there for, I don't know, all sorts of bizarre reasons. But my mother thought it was very safe. So, and it was, because most of the men weren't interested in me. They were more interested in, other things. But anyway, but it was so much fun, and I learned so much, and it was just a wonderful experience. And there were so many wonderful people from Hyde Park who were, participated. It was terrific.
She got me a job too, but it wasn't at the Playhouse. She came out one day, I was in front of the house, and she said, would you like a babysitting job for the summer? And she got me a job babysitting for the director, and then his wife, who was an actress. So she got me a job for the whole summer. I was very grateful to her.
So I know it's hot and everybody probably needs to get going, but please feel free to ask any questions or whatever comments. And we thank you so much for coming, and thanks to the Park Service.
I need to thank Cindy, because I didn't.
Oh, yes.
Hold on for 1
Right,
second.
we have to thank one very important person.
So just a couple of things. I do have one Harry Belafonte story about Eleanor Roosevelt. I think you can hear me, right? Yeah. So, Harry Belafonte was an Eleanor Roosevelt Val-kill medal recipient. And so he came one day to present the medal to Susan Sarandon. And he told this story about when he was young, he had come over to Stone Cottage, and Eleanor Roosevelt was grilling hot dogs. And with him was Shirley Temple and her mother. And Shirley Temple liked to play with slingshots. So she took out her slingshot and aimed it right at Mrs. Roosevelt's behind and hit her. And of course, you know what her mother did. Mrs. Roosevelt just, nothing, as if nothing had happened. That's the kind of, this is why I love the work that I do, because I learned these lessons that you just can't take yourself too seriously, really. And you do the very best that you can, not just for yourself, but for others. And I want to thank you guys for sharing those amazing, amazing stories.
And we have to give a salute to Cindy.
Well, we're going to do that now.
Okay.
So there's one more person I want to thank.
Yes.
When Nina mentioned that we were in the legislation as part of the Park Service, that's because our organization was saved by a very dedicated group of Hyde Park people from the Hyde Park Visual Environmental Group. That group formed a subcommittee and became Eleanor Roosevelt's Val-kill, subsequently incorporated and saved this site. And once that happened, it had to be taken over by the National Park Service. The Warren Hill, who was the superintendent at the time, actually helped facilitate that. The building where we worked out of, Cindy Kernan, Charlie Kernan was in that building. Our building is just down the street. It's no longer, the home that was there is no longer there. We have a beautiful new center, and please come visit it. But Cindy is passing on, helping out with everything that still goes on around here. I just met her because of you. She's Barbara's daughter.
I just want to share too, it happened very kind of kismetly.
Yeah.
I'm an innkeeper at my friend Jonna's bed and breakfast, the old Rhinebeck Inn. And we had a guest call and they wanted to see the Roosevelt estate. All that I was telling people about the Roosevelts and everything. So she was very interested in Val-kill. She said, my neighbor is Nina Roosevelt. And so I just very briefly said, all right, I'm Marshall Les's granddaughter and all that, and told her who I was. And the next day, I get an email from Nina. And so that kind of brought the reunion about, and she said, I'm going to be here for a board meeting. And so I asked my mom and Janet if they could make it, and we kind of started this whole reunion. And then I met Kathleen to, and Nina's like, do you don't mind talking for a little bit? I love that. One story that I want to share from my grandparents is there was times when Eleanor was here without any guests, and she would eat with my grandparents. And she always would go in and kiss them goodnight and tell them that she loved them.
Look at that.
Again, I didn't appreciate it either, but I'm in a position too that I get to share these stories with my guests, and everybody loves it, and I realize how important it is. And also to hear my family share is really special.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to make this.
And you were born at Val-kill, correct? And lived just down the road. Let's not forget that part. So again, thank you for
Thank you all for coming.
Well, we did it.
You are a star.
We did it.
And were you nervous?
No, I swear to God, I just said she's up there looking down and we have to say good things.
That is so wonderful.
I'm on the board
Yes.
with Nina. It was very interesting.